but no, I knew about the Pavlovian Society. Nat Schoenfeld's in it, and a lot
What?
of people. Nat Schoenfeld is in it, and so on. But
Yes, because...
I'm sparing about joining things. It's just
well, you know, it's only by invitation.
Mm-hmm.
And because I've struggled to keep it balanced, for one thing, not all one group. Not, I keep a balance among psychologists and physicians and physiologists. And I think it's much more interesting than if you just get all one group in it. And also, it just started among the people who were doing the research in those 3 laboratories, and it's gradually grown one at a time. And we have about 100 domestic members and about 75 foreign members. But you would, I say, if anybody deserves, or if there, you should certainly be.
Well, it's very good of you to say so. I have tried to keep track.
Well, I don't know any. I've never had a better evaluation, more balanced, and also very appreciative. One never objects to having his work appreciated.
Well, you know, it's your life record of your work is remarkable. And I think perhaps one of the things that would be of great interest here would be to talk a little bit about how all this came about. You didn't intend to start. You didn't intend to study with Pavlov when you,
that's right.
when you joined up with him.
When you say, how does it come about? My work has been largely patterned just rather than, I'm going to find out a certain thing, that I'm going to find out the cause of experimental neurosis. It begins with something from which you get a lead, and then keep following that lead as long as it's interesting. Now, I'm still working, on what I began in the, I suppose I began it in the late 30s. The role of the periphery, about mid-30s, the role of the periphery and the central nervous system in forming the conditional reflex. Well,
this is the work with Laux.
Yes. Well, it's extended, with drugs, and not only these electrodes, but with drugs that stimulate the periphery and those that act through the central nervous system, such as atropine on the peripheral heart, and morphine, produces a central effect. Well, one of my young collaborators, let's see, some recent work I was doing was stimulating the cranial end of the cut vagus, and he said to me, well, you've done all that work. Why are you doing it? Why are you still doing it? I said, well, I'm not finished. I want to try a large number of cases. And I'm always looking for an exception to see when it doesn't work.
That's right. And so many of those studies, too, in effect showed that you couldn't produce conditioning.
Yes.
And so to establish a universal negative, you have to really do a lot of experiments.
And I think some people are driven away by the idea of a negative experiment, don't you?
I'm afraid so, yet we need more of them.
But if you comprehend the picture, the whole picture of the negative with the positive, then you get a complete picture.
That's right.
Whereas if you just one negative may not mean anything, but taken together with a lot of positive, it defines and outlines the whole picture, doesn't it?
It gives you the boundaries,
yes.
the limits of a concept or a field. Well, how did you get started in this? I mean, you know that I know about it, but I think the people who are listening to this would be very interested in the history of it.
Well, when I was in medical school, I thought of going into neurology and psychiatry. But then I saw so much confusion in psychiatry. I tried to make something out of Freud's interpretation of dreams, and then even in neurology, for example, I expected in neurology that you would get to a position where you could predict something. You could predict a Babinski reflex. But, you know, all these things were just empirical. I mean, you got a Babinski, but nobody knew why you got a Babinski in certain diseases. And so, with the great state of confusion in psychiatry and my disappointment that Freud didn't solve the questions, I mean, it was so subjective, and as my friend Das Basser said about Freud, he is really more of a poet and a philosopher than he is a scientist. I gave up the idea of going into psychiatry and neurology. Now, when I met Pavlov...
was it this? You gave up on this before you went?
Yes,
with
before I went to Russia. And so when I was interning, I was preparing for internal medicine. And when I went to Russia, my idea was that I'd go into internal medicine. And when I was extremely impressed with the brilliance of Pavlov's ability to reduce a complex situation to simplicity and to get the answers from the experiment. Now, seeing his conditional reflex work impressed me very deeply, but I still thought I would go into internal medicine, and most of the experimental work I did with Pavlov was in the field of gastroenterology, the physiology of the digestive system.
Well, I'd wondered about that, since you're interested in internal medicine.
Yes.
You may have started with him then.
Although I observed and became familiar with all of his concepts of conditioning, and at that time Pavlov was much more interested in the conditional reflex than he was in physiology of digestion.
This was in 1922, 23.
Yes. He had gotten the Nobel Prize, you know, for physiology of digestion in 1904.
4 or 5.
Yes. But so I worked. I stayed with Pavlov because I was impressed that here was a person. Not only was I fascinated with his character, but that wouldn't have kept me in Russia under all those hardships. And I had to go, for certain periods, you'd go 6 months without seeing an egg, for example. I lived just like a Russian there when I went back to work with Pavlov. But I stayed with Pavlov until I felt that I had learned all the physiology that I could learn, that is, from him. That is, that I had learned, came to a point where it was a point of diminishing returns. And I had borrowed money to stay with him and work with him. The Soviet government offered to pay me a salary the last 2 years I was there, I mean beginning at the last 2 years. But I didn't take it because I didn't want to be under obligation to a communist government, and I didn't approve of them, so I didn't feel, I thought it would, well, I didn't like the idea of taking money from them. And so I borrowed money to stay and work with Pavlov. I gradually learned Russian to work with him and translate his books. Well, one thing led to another. When I was in Russia, I was not only interested, and this illustrates what you call peripheral vision. I saw that in Russia, during the famine and revolution, there were these tremendous epidemics of smallpox and cholera and also all kinds of diseases that we have in this country, such as hypertension and diabetes and amenorrhea and gynecological diseases, that they changed under the influence of the famine. Mm-hmm. And, well, there was famine and revolution and war. Well, I was interested...
But the pictures of these diseases changed.
Yes, they changed under that influence. Mm-hmm. And so I became interested, what effect does famine and revolution and all that disturbance have on the incidence of disease, such as heart disease or diabetes? And so I went around and collected data on all these diseases. Now, the administrative head of the American Relief, that was beginning in 1922-23, when I was with the American Relief, and also at the same time I started work in Pavlov's laboratory in the evenings and off times and weekends. And I was collecting these data. I had to go from office to office, and the administrative head said to me, he said, "You're just wasting your time." He said, "There'll never be 6 people in the world who will ever read that." Well, that has opened up what the medical historian Garrison calls a new field of public health called geomedicine. Now, he gives me credit for opening up a field of geomedicine.
For heaven's sakes, now this is quite new to me. I didn't...
And I wrote up the only data that was published abroad of the mortality and morbidity from diseases in Russia during the Revolution and Famine. Because the Russians, they wouldn't publish those figures because they didn't want the outside world to know how weak they were and how bad conditions were. And I was the one who collected all that data during that period. Now, in the second famine they had, which was engineered by Stalin in 1932, 33, 35, because he collected the grain, you know.
This is a liquidation of
yes, liquidation of peasants that resisted. And you see, they went to the extent, and I published this in my History of Russian Medicine, they changed the name of typhus fever, typhus, spotted typhus, which was just raging at that time in the second period of famine. And that was, didn't have to be, but Stalin sold all this grain abroad, you know, to buy heavy machinery and for militarization. Now, when I went to Moscow to ask for the statistics, that was when I was visiting Pavlov in 33, for how much typhus they had, he said, "We don't have that now. We don't have any." Well, that's what, you see, the propaganda. They had abolished all these diseases. That's what they told you. Well, what they had done, there was an edict published, Stalin, the originator, that we shall no longer use the word typhus. We will call it disease form number 2. Mm-hmm. And so if you didn't know to ask for disease form number 2, they didn't have any typhus. No. That's how they manipulated figures.
Well, that's quite a far cry from the work you did with Pavlov and this,
yes.
Your own career. It's almost as if you had a second small career.
Yes, and I followed that up, and I traveled over Europe to collect data and statistics in the countries that had been at war, such as Germany and France, comparing them with the neutral countries. And I wrote that up in my medical, it's a chapter called Change in Type and Incidence of Disease in my medical review of Soviet Russia. Now, you want to know how I developed an interest in Pavlov
went
and
ahead
that
with
work?
Pavlov and how you got launched on the career that's been your major interest.
Well, now I tried to learn everything that I could learn from Pavlov about conditional reflex, but I didn't continue. At first, the first work I did with Pavlov, I wanted to find out the answer to something I'd been working on in America. So I worked on that problem in Pavlov's lab with the methods that were available there. But it wasn't an interest of Pavlov's.
This was a digestive problem.
Yes, it was effective magnesium sulfate on expulsion of bile. Now, I solved that problem. It puzzled me why you got it, and I solved that. And then Pavlov's assistant said, "Well, you ought to ask Pavlov to assign you some problems, so you will learn what he's doing." And so I did ask Pavlov to give me a problem. Well, Pavlov was a very interesting person in that he would allow a person to work on. He didn't really force them to work on his problems. But if you worked on something else, he wouldn't take an interest in it. He'd just neglect you, you know. And so his burning interest then was conditional reflex. So he gave me a problem in that. And, well, I did about 2 problems on conditional reflex in the 5 or 6 years I was with him. Now, I didn't work anymore on those problems because I felt that once I knew the method, that's all I needed. I could, in the future, continue to work on problems myself. And the method was simple to learn. And I preferred to get a basis for gastroenterology and to work on the physiology of digestion. And so I asked Pavlov to give me problems in that, because in that I learned to operate on animals, and I learned a great deal more than I'd learned just repeating like a technician work in conditional reflex problems. But then one thing led to another, and while I was there, I stayed with that plan. I was just going to finish. I felt that if I went back to America and got in harness again, I'd never get out. And now was the time to do the research that I was interested in. So I just stayed and continued that without any plan as to how long I was going to stay. And during that time I learned Russian, and I translated Pavlov's book from Russian into English, and I say one thing dovetailed into another. Now, while I was working in Pavlov's laboratory, John Dewey came there and met me, and I interpreted for him. And also Alan Gregg, who was the head of the medical section of the Rockefeller Foundation, and he was located in Paris then. And they told Adolf Meyer, who was head of the Phipps Clinic at Hopkins, about my work. Well, Adolf Meyer was, did you ever know him?
No, I just know of him.
Yeah. Well, he was a great fellow, he not only had a sincere interest, I think, in a multiple approach to psychiatry from many different angles, but I think he also liked window dressing. He liked to get people that were unusual or doing something unusual and have them around. And for that reason, I think he wrote to me in this winter, I think it was February 1929, that he'd heard of me through John Dewey and heard of my work through John Dewey and Alan Gregg, and that he thought we might combine our mutual urges to advantage, which in his enigmatic language he thought was giving me an appointment at the Phipps.
And you didn't understand that at all?
No, I didn't understand that, and I came back to America with Pavlov and 11 other physiologists at the time of the International Physiological Congress, which was in Boston in 1929. And while I was there, I was talking with Roundtree, who was from the Mayo Clinic, and I had had some correspondence with him because I was interested in liver pathology and physiology, and he had been doing work on that. And he promised me a fellowship to go and work at the Mayo Clinic. Well, it would be in research, but it wasn't Pavlovian work, but I didn't have any other position, and that did give me something that I would be interested in doing. And I told Adolf Meyer, I just mentioned it to him. He was going around with me a good deal, and I introduced him to Pavlov. Well, he made it known that he thought he had given me an appointment at the Phipps Clinic.
And what were you doing looking at these other jobs?
And then he promised, that stimulated him, and he promised to build me a Pavlovian laboratory, and they put the camera there to do Pavlovian work. And so that was closer to what I wanted to do at that time. And so it was a very welcome appointment. So I went there in the fall of 29, and my idea about finances and money has changed too. Now, Adolf Meyer said, well, how much money do you want? How much do you need? And I said, I don't know how much it takes to live in America. And I said, what is the range of what you pay for this position. And he said, well, from 3,000 to 6,500. And I said, well, how much does it take for a single person to live? And he said, well, about 3,500. Well, I said, well, that's enough for me. Just give me 3,500. Well, if I'd known the method of universities then, that they get you for what they can and keep you at that.
Sure.
So I lived on that 3,500 for many years.
Oh, my.
And even up into the 40s. When I retired at Hopkins, my average salary for the last 10 years was $7,500.
For heaven's sake.
That was in 1958.
That is incredible. And in a sense, this all started with this
I could
initial
have gotten
commitment
double
with,
that if I'd...
yeah. That is really amazing.
But,
And I think it's a stunning commentary, too.
But I still think, you know, in my life, in spite of that not very large amounts that I've gotten paid, I still feel that I've been able to do practically everything I wanted in my life.
Well, I get the impression from what you said that Adolf Meyer opening this laboratory for you, in a sense, crystallized something which hadn't really quite been firmed up as yet. You were considering Mayo Clinic, liver
Yes,
function,
well, you see, I
you
didn't
just
have any
know,
opportunity.
yeah.
I hadn't corresponded with anybody but Roundtree, and I'd been interested in the liver, and I hadn't applied for anything. Now, Alan Gregg, who took a lot of interest in me when he saw me in Russia, and I think he said this in order to just sound me out. He said, oh, when you go back to America, he said, you can go to some Midwestern town and you can easily get $12,000 or $13,000 in the beginning. Well, that didn't appeal to me at all, you know.
Yeah.
And I felt rather despondent that he felt that that was my future. And but I think he was trying me out to see how much I was interested in money or research, because the Rockefeller Foundation took over the support of my laboratory through Alan Gregg for 15 years after it started. And then they gave a terminal grant of another 5 years.
This is so. Well, they supported you really through 1950, or very
Yes,
close to it through
yes.
1950, and that's a nice long continued
Yes, it
support.
was. Although my laboratory was running on $11,000 up until about 1950, including my own salary, a secretary, a technician, care for all dogs,
For
and
heaven's
apparatus.
Good
And
heavens.
when I started, 11,500 wasn't bad, but dog food went up from 1.5 cents a pound. Livers that you'd feed the dogs on went up from that to about 15 cents a pound in that period. And so it got to be a small amount. But that was what my laboratory, essentially what my laboratory ran on until about 1950, including everything.
And then who took over the support?
Well, then I got a few grants. I got from the American Heart Association. I got a grant, I think they gave me $25,000 a year in about 1950. And then I got about a grant from one or two drug companies, about $5,000. Well, $25,000 seemed like a lot of money, and for what I had been getting to support the lab. And then finally, some of the cardiac people. Well, this thing, it's maybe jumping ahead, but it has a connection. When let's see, when was that? It was about 1950. There was, 55. It was somewhere in that period. It must have been toward the late 50s. There was a group of Russian cardiologists visiting in this country, and they came to see my laboratory. Now, my wife said to me, they came on a day that I was scheduled to give a paper at the American Psychiatric. And my wife said, well, it's much more important for you to see them. And I hated to cancel that because I don't like, to obligate myself. But I did cancel that. And I think it was a discussion, not a paper. So I canceled that and stayed to meet them. Well, there were 6 cardiologists. They came to see my work. And Paul Dudley White was one of the people receiving them. Dr. Andrus, who was professor of cardiology at Hopkins. You may know of him.
I just know
He's
of him. I don't.
Well-known cardiologist. They thought of getting him for Eisenhower, but he was, instead of Paul Dudley White, but he was out of town, so they got Paul Dudley White. Well, I'd done a little work with him, but they were some of the people who received these cardiologists. Well, when these Russian cardiologists left, they were asked, well, what did you see that you consider most important? And they mentioned my work. They said, we don't have anything like that going on in Russia with the cardiac conditional reflex.
They hadn't done all this work. You've been conditioning cardiac reflexes for a generation by then.
And on the basis of that, it's very interesting commentary on how you can be working in a university on something and right under the noses of people who pay no attention to it until they hear of it from somewhere else.
Well, somebody else tells them that it's good, and then they're glad to have it.
Among that group of Americans who were with them was Jim Watt, who was head of the cardiac section at NIH, and was Andrus, who was a cardiologist at Hopkins, and was Paul Dudley White. Well, when they heard that from the Russians, they got together and said, well, none of this work is going on in America except mine, so I should get some support. So they got together, Andrus and Watt and from NIH, and decided that I ought to get some support. They said that on the basis of what the Russians had told them.
For heaven's sakes. Well, we're always having to be jogged in this way.
And you see, I got a big grant then of $500,000.
This was really the first large pool of money that you had ever had for this work.
And in a way it helped because I had been using one cardiac instrument to record heart rates and counting them all, visually. And from the time I started in 1933, now that was given to me by the Brush Development Company, and I knew the president, and he gave me the first cardio-tachometer, and then he kept renewing it and not charging me until about 1950-some, 55, I believe. And so really most of my cardiac work was done with that one small instrument.
One thing where you're visual scanning, visual counting.
Now that costs less than $600, even in the 50s. Just a simple cardio-tachometer. Now, the cameras that we have and equipped under that big grant of $500,000, which went on for 7 years, when each camera, it costs $20,000 to equip one camera. It just shows the difference. But the achievements were not.
I was going to ask you,
are
the achievements proportionately changed?
Because, first, if you get a lot of people working with you, it's of course it has a place, and with a good administrator, he can do a good deal with increased numbers. But on the other hand, it takes a lot of attention, administration.
Yeah.
And my type of work, my type of working gets along better with plenty of time to do thinking and to have a smaller number of very well-focused problems.
And you actually do a lot of the experimentation yourself. You're
did,
there.
yes, yes. And I still, I still try to go down and inspect the work of the technicians once a week, because I feel that First, you don't know what they're doing, what they're getting away with, unless you go down and watch it yourself. Then you get new ideas when you see the animal, don't you?
That's right. You won't. This is where the peripheral vision comes.
Yes, that's a good
focus,
expression.
yeah.
And you have to stay in contact with the work in order, to get new ideas from the work. Now, there's a certain type of science, especially in physics, where you look over other people's results, as Einstein did, and you formulate, well, gravity. Light has to travel in curved lines around a gravitational mass. Well, and as Planck. Well, in that type of, where logic and mathematics do most of it, or can do so much of it, whereas in biology, there's so many forces. You can't make the prediction in biology that you can in physics and chemistry and those pure sciences from just a few
You're really
premises.
talking about the importance of the trained, alert, and sensitive investigator as a research instrument.
Yes.
And its importance in biological research.
And I don't think in biology, and I'd like to know what you think, I don't think you can just sit as Einstein or Planck did and look over the figures and say, well, this will happen. Because I think on account of the complexity of the living organism, you never know what the dominant force will be. Now, if there's a satellite going around the Earth at a certain distance, you know what the dominant force is. You know that it's the Earth, that the moon has some effect, the sun has some effect. But you know what the dominant force is, and there are very few forces. Now, with the living organism, the number of forces are so numerous, and you never know what will be dominant, do you?
I don't think that you do. Of course, there's a lot of sort of paper and pencil, sit-at-the-desk research that is done in psychology and biology.
Now, what has been the success of that?
I don't know how well it's worked out.
Yes, in what fields do you think that is successful?
I'm not sure that it's been very successful at all over the long pull. I think that what's had to happen is a sensitive observer and a man who's sophisticated paying close attention to what happens in new situations of his or somebody else's devising is the essential ingredient for creative progress. I don't know any other way to do it.
Now, how would you know, for example, that a difficult differentiation produces a nervous disturbance? If I were trying to do it by logic, I would think of it this way. All right, it produces some tension that the dog is hungry and he doesn't know which signal is going to mean food because he can't differentiate the two. But then the dog will just neglect the whole problem and not be worried by it. Now, if I were predicting, that's the way I would predict it. But as you know, it turned out differently. The dog didn't neglect it, and he became neurotic.
Paid very close attention to it. And in fact, it took over all of his behavior and became his reigning passion.
And then,
for a while.
furthermore, after Pavlov showed that there was a role to difficult differentiation, then comes in this effective person, which you couldn't predict again. And so
I think I'm a bad person. I'm a bad person for you to ask about this because I'm completely devoted to the notion of going out and seeing what happens, not just sitting at the desk and thinking about it. I'd like to think about it after I have seen it.
Yes.
Thought is very good.
You've got to put a lot of thought into it.
That's right.
Don't
but you have to see what happens.
Yes.
And
you've got to put really consistent, hard thinking and a very critical thinking.
There's one way I suppose this might be taken up, and that is in terms of this fashionable term paradigms. Our paradigms in the study of behavior and biology are not as complete as they are in the physical sciences.
Yes.
They're much less completely finished.
Yes.
Half-baked is another way of saying it. And so we can't trust them for logical purposes.
Yes.
We can't count on them as really enumerating all the significant factors that may have a bearing on what's going to happen. One of the things that has struck me is that someone who knows dogs might very well expect that this dog would pay very close attention to something that was ambiguous. This would be the thing that would capture him, whereas somebody who had come up through, say, some theoretical school, some theoretical approach to conditioning, might very well simply say he would disregard it.
Yes.
And this green thumb for the organism,
Yes.
as I like to call it, is tremendously important. I remember I mentioned the Brelands
Yes.
this morning.
I
Well,
know.
Keller Breland had a
Yes.
very good green thumb for organisms, and he paid attention
Yes.
to a lot of things that other people who were running animals in Skinner boxes simply weren't sensitive to. And because of this, I mean, I think he made some very significant discoveries. And then the paradigm resisted incorporation of these discoveries, and only now it's beginning to take them over and incorporate them. So that I think the situation in the social sciences and the biological sciences is very different from the physical sciences
Yes,
and
I
mathematics.
think it. I mean, biology is, for the time being, a lot of it's bound to be, in the big sense of the whole behavior, is bound to be experimental, isn't it? And observational.
Experimental, empirical,
Yes,
pragmatic,
yes,
and
yes.
it's premature
Yes.
to develop these elegant theories. You know, something that you were telling me made me wonder. You had a whole succession of people working with you, Roscoe Dykman, Hoffman, Roger Laux,
Yes.
people like that. You, all during these years at Hopkins, you had a succession of quite high-powered colleagues, associates, students, apprentices. And how did that come about?
Well, and up until about 1955, none of them was paid a salary from not from my resources.
Yeah, well, this
Out
is
of
what I assumed,
$11,000, I couldn't pay.
You couldn't pay them. Yeah.
But now Laux and some of those early people, they were National Research Fellows, and they just elected to work with me. They knew of my work, I'd heard of it, and so they wrote to me and wanted to work with me. Then there were people around Hopkins that I collaborated with because I felt that the combination of their knowledge would be of use in what I was doing, such as the professor of physiology, E.K. Marshall. Now, so I got them mostly because they had heard of my work and they were interested in coming and working. And that's where you get the best people.
Mm-hmm. So this wasn't a program on your part. You were doing what you were doing.
Yes.
And if someone wanted to come along,
they just
could come.
applied to come and work with me.
Very much the same way you became affiliated with Pavlov,
Yes.
in a sense.
And I was interested in certain things, and they fell into what my interests were. Now, Laux came, you see, he had an electrical engineering background, and he had an idea of destroying certain parts of the brain by implanting little iron globules that would pick up a current.
An induction current.
Yes.
By induction.
And now I said to him, at that time I was very much interested in the parts of the reflex arc. And so I said it'll be much more of interest to use this induction to, and I devised a method. Well, he devised the actual electrical part of it, but I had the scheme of putting buried coils underneath the skin and stimulating various parts of the nervous system to see which parts you could eliminate and still get the conditional reflex. So another initiation of that interest of the exploring what part of the reflex arc was important. A medical student named Light came to me. You know about his work, don't you? He had read, about curare, and Harlow and Stagner, couldn't get conditioning under curare, and he wanted to repeat that work. Well, I said to him, drugs are always hazardous because you never know how much of a poisoning effect they will have.
Where they're actually operating.
Yes. So it would be much better to crush the anterior nerve roots and paralyze a limb of the dog, the leg, and train him during the period of paralysis, and then let him rest until regeneration, and then see if he lifts his leg, though he's never lifted it
without ever
in
having made
practice.
the response.
Yes.
And
So that's how that end of it started with me. And so we got different results from Harlow and Stagnant. But they repeated, I think, with smaller doses of curare and got the
as
same
I
thing.
recall, they used a whopping dose.
Yes.
In fact, that's was characteristic of a lot of psychology, to use very large doses, enough to make a difference. And they made so much difference that your effect would wash out.
So that was how, then after eliminating that periphery and starting with Laux on stimulating with buried coils, different parts of the reflex arc, I got into the whole question of what part of the reflex arc is essential, and then which led to the idea of the central nervous system being the primary formation and of the conditional reflex, primary seat, and that you really don't need the periphery. You don't need the sense organ, and you don't need the executor organ, and you can form it then entirely within, and that helped to bring about the idea of autokinesis, that the conditional reflex is a central phenomenon.
And that central processes, as they run off, can lead to real changes in the conditioning.
Yes.
Which will be reflected by peripheral behavior, but which don't depend on it.
Yes.
And, this is very interesting, and I'm thinking in connection with, say, some of the Miller-DeCara work in which they've paralyzed the peripheral response with curare, but that, of course, doesn't necessarily
what is
change
that work?
well, I'm thinking of some of the conditioning of various operant conditioning
Yes.
of various kinds of physiological responses. And that paralyzing the animal's skeletal motor effector apparatus wouldn't necessarily guarantee at all that an efferent pattern with one of its components being the autonomic response couldn't be occurring all the time. So in effect, you're not reinforcing or rewarding an autonomic response. You're rewarding a whole pattern of responding, which you simply can't see objectively, simply because you've knocked out the effectors. And it's the outflow which is important. The efferent pattern is important.
I'm not very favorably impressed with Neil Miller's work. I don't think it's critical. I don't think he looks at his results critically. Now, because I don't feel it's fair to condemn a person's work unless you see exactly how they do it.
I think this is very, very important because, as he's discovered, they've had some problems in replicating it, and this has led to him to pay much or very close attention to what's going on, and it turns out that small details are extremely critical
and
determining whether they can get the results.
And I think that he is very largely a salesman, and now I have repeated both his work. Well, his didn't come until much later, but I started repeating Bikoff's work on the kidney. Now, Bikoff reported, and I believed Bikoff's work, I didn't have any reason not to believe it. He reported, very kind of precise and rather elegant-looking experiments where you got a conditional diuresis. And I firmly believe that his results. Now, I started with some transplanted kidneys in the neck, so to be devoid of nervous connections, just to corroborate the nervous control and the hormonal, and working with 2 dogs for about 3 or 4 years, exhaustively, as I could work with them until they died, and they were in health most of the time. I mean, there was not the slightest result of any renal diuresis in any element. Now then I tried doing dogs with the normal kidneys, with the external ureters, and as Beekhoff had done, and I never was able to get the slightest diuresis conditioned. And I could get some slight inhibitory conditional reflex to stress. If you would give the animal pain, the kidney would shut down and you could get a small inhibitory effect. Now when I began to look at those results and to look at what is the function of the kidney, it appeared to me this way, that you initially, Neil Miller, Beekhoff, see the kidney as an equivalent to the salivary gland. You ring a bell and you get something from the kidney the way you get saliva from the salivary gland. And they are kind of fooled, you know, by that paradigm, and that without looking at what is the function of the kidney.
The gland is, yes.
What is the function of the salivary gland? Well, the function of the kidney is to maintain an even balance in the blood. Now, if the kidney would start, you know, with conditioning every time there was a signal for water, whether the water came or not, if it would start throwing out all these electrolytes and everything that comes out in the urine, it would be depleting the body. And if you look at the physiology, the difference, you see what the kidney secretes can never be reabsorbed. It goes into the pelvis of the kidney, no reabsorption.
That's right.
It goes down to the bladder, no reabsorption. It's on the way out. Now, a human...
Well, once it gets past the tubules, it's gone.
Yes. Now, the human and the dog, they can secrete 2 or 3 quarts of saliva or gastric juice. If it's not used, if it's just secreted as some abnormal conditioning, inappropriate conditioning, it's all reabsorbed. It's not discharged, it's reabsorbed into the bloodstream. And so you've got to look at the physiology of what you're working with. And the heart is to prepare for quick action. The gastrointestinal glands are to prepare for receiving the food quickly. But the kidney is a slow-acting organ to maintain a balance in the blood, and that led me to the idea of organ system responsibility.
Well, when I read that paper, a little phrase occurred to me, and I don't know whether it's correct or not. In other words, the kidney, in a sense, responds to what has happened and takes care of its consequences, whereas these other systems are responding to what might happen in the future.
And the kidney doesn't, it's a slow-acting organ. It doesn't have to.
It doesn't have to anticipate.
It wouldn't do anything useful if it just started ahead of time. It'd be like somebody who jumped a gun, wouldn't it?
Well, I can see how if it started ahead of time and the expected change in water intake didn't occur, it could kick out a lot of electrolytes and leave the animal badly depleted.
Right. Yes.
That's the kind of an animal with a kidney like that wouldn't be very likely to survive in a Darwinian struggle.
Now you
to
see
reproduce himself.
the dog going downhill. If you do the esophageal fistula and you see he loses a lot of saliva and electrolytes because it comes out, unless you make some provision for it to go on down, it comes out in his neck. And so he loses that, and he will get thinner and thinner and go downhill, because that's an abnormal situation where he loses what he's putting out. But ordinarily the saliva goes in the stomach and is reabsorbed, and he doesn't lose those things. But Neil Miller has claimed he got conditional diuresis. Now I want to propose to Neil Miller, I don't know whether anything will come of it, that since I disagree radically from his results, I like to plan some experiments together, and he can check mine and I'll check his, to settle this question of organ system responsibility in the kidney.
That'd be very interesting.
Now,
Have you talked to him about it?
No, I haven't, but I don't believe he'd do it. Now,
he's a fair-minded person.
He
I
is?
think he'd be. Oh yes, I know him quite well.
I'll suggest.
I don't know whether he would do it or
Yes.
not. He's very busy.
But you see,
I think it's
I
very
think it's an
important to do.
essential thing. I mean, I can't say that. You see, my criticism of his work is that I think he takes small results, and as you mentioned, you know that you can't. You mentioned this morning in discussion that you can't just take a little result and draw a big conclusion from it. And I think, as I was misled by Bikoff's work, that I was making a stereotyped judgment about every organ in the body, the same as the salivary gland and the cardiovascular system. And that in doing that, in giving them this stereotype pattern to work on, you are neglecting what the function of the organ is, the physiological function. And that conditioning will have to begin looking at the function and working within that framework of physiological function. Now, at present, I have the results on which I base the idea of organ system responsibility. I have it only for the kidney. Now, I'd like to repeat it with other systems.
There must be other systems which have the same kind of.
Well, there must be. For example, sweating and.
Gallbladder. Well, I don't know the gallbladder. Sweating is some of these responses are parts of a much larger response. I think of the galvanic response.
It takes a lot of thinking
and
and devising, doesn't it, to work that out?
Absolutely.
But I think that would be very interesting to pursue that, and I don't feel that you can rest on just one organ, just the renal diuresis, and I think much more work has to be done.
I'd like to, if I could, just change the subject rather abruptly, because I think this would be quite of a lot of interest to our audience. You were in a department of psychiatry for many years, and I was wondering if how you saw now in retrospect the relation between your activities in your laboratory and the various developments in psychiatry over this long period of time.
Well,
what was the input? What was the output?
You see, my work has been largely from a point of view of scientific analysis, rather than using it in a way of behavior therapy, for example. Now, when I was working with human beings in the psychiatric clinic, I was trying to find out in these inhibitory states, in catatonia and some forms of schizophrenia, whether they had lost the ability throughout to form conditional reflexes. And I was also working on what is the effect of electroshock therapy on the ability to form conditional reflexes. And it seemed to me that those were questions that had to be that should be solved. Now, I don't think you see, psychiatry has shown very little interest in work that I've done with the patient, and they are much more interested in the application and idea of schizokinesis. Now, that interests them a great deal. And that's easier for them to understand.
Well, they meet it regularly.
Yes, and
the
I
presence of
think
an
it's an
inhibited
important
person
principle.
Externally who is tremendously alerted.
And I'm really
internally,
surprised that people are that much interested in the idea of schizokinesis. But that has gone over very well. Autokinesis they don't get so clearly.
Well, I don't know if they do or not, but autokinesis is a very real phenomenon in
It
terms
certainly
of
is.
you can see it in the laboratory.
Yes. And you see it in
animals,
life all the
that's all
time.
in life all the time. People change behaviors when they've never had any conditioning experiences, as far as you know, which could explain the change in behavior, but whether it grows out of a previous
But one thing, it's so much easier to collect data, precise data, with schizokinesis, isn't it? I mean, you can measure heart rate, you can compare it with salivation, you can compare it with motor behavior.
Now,
And it's easy to compare, but autokinesis still waits on a good method, a good scientific method, doesn't it?
Well, that, and also there has to be some set of ideas to give you some reason for predicting which way these developments will go, which way it'll grow.
Yes.
The behavior repertoire will grow. And this is something I don't think we understand too well, and you haven't been able really to make predictions.
No, I can make some prediction as to what dogs will be susceptible to stress.
But then once they've been susceptible to stress, and
Well, you
develop
can
the
make-
neurosis, then you give them the rest. Can you predict what they're going to show
No, I don't.
after
No,
some
you
period
can't
of
now.
time?
But I think there may be certain examinations, perhaps biochemical. I think there are many avenues of study that may lead to a prediction. Now, that is why I am so much interested in a establishment of a preventive psychiatry.
I think this is what your work has done really has raised some very important questions. And it's the answers to these questions, or the search for them, that's going to push psychiatry further ahead. I mean, you have
Well, I
some
hope
hard
so.
you have some hard phenomena that have to be
Yes,
explained.
yes.
I mean, what happened with Nick, you know, when he was after he rested for a while, and this has to be explained. It didn't come from nowhere. And I'm
Well,
taking some of our data in the lab.
I've been I've been writing in my papers occasionally, and I really didn't know how much I'd written and how often until I began looking over. I become, in the last year or 2 years, very much interested in establishing a study for preventive psychiatry. And I found that I first mentioned it under the term preventive or prophylactic psychiatry, outlining a method by conditional reflex of studying it. In 1942, I published that, called Measures of Susceptibility.
The first I'd run into it was around in 1953.
Yes.
in the
Well,
53
then
paper, but,
I found that in about a half a dozen papers, I've outlined the idea in going through that I didn't even remember that I had. If you're interested, I can send you those
I would
papers.
like very much to see them. Perhaps the people who are listening to this would like a little thumbnail sketch of.
Well, I saw that in certain dogs that I studied, and that did break down under various stresses in the laboratory, that they showed some abnormalities that, in reviewing what they showed, that would serve as for giving a predictive value to those results. Now, if you get in a dog, if you give him a difficult differentiation, and by measuring heart rate and respiration, which are very important additional measures to salivation or motor, you begin to see a disturbance in respiration and cardiovascular function before you see it in the salivary conditional reflex or in the motor behavior, in the skeletal musculature. And if you produce a small amount of stress, you can see disturbances in those two systems. Now, I have some laboratory data to support a belief that that type of stress imposed on the dog will give you certain disturbances in respiration and cardiovascular function accompanying the conditional reflex that help to predict to what degree that dog will succumb to a bigger stress.
You really can use this to pick dogs who would be at risk.
Yes, that's
if
what
the
I
stress
think.
is increased.
Yes. But you have to use a large number of dogs, and it takes a great deal of work to follow them a long time and to grade these stresses, and so it's a big work.
Have you attempted anything by way of insulating, some conditioning procedure which might insulate these dogs that are highly likely to break down from the effects of stress? Can you block the effects of stress on them?
Well, I think you can.
The prophylactic
Yes.
kind of thing.
Well, yes, I think so, and I haven't definitely proven it.
Well, because I think this would be tremendously
But that's
interesting
work for the future, I think.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Gantt. I've really enjoyed this.
Well, it's certainly been a pleasure and a stimulus to talk to you about.
Well, 20 years has passed very fast. Is all I can
When
say.
did you leave Chicago and come here?
1962.
Yes.
And,
And are you? What relationship is your department to the psychiatric department?
oh, I'm in and as far as Columbia is concerned, I'm in the Department of Psychiatry.
Oh,
I'm
you're
also
working entirely within the department?
That's right. No, and then I'm also in the graduate school downtown at the Department